Hi, good morning. Welcome everyone to our webinar on the VSME. I think we'll wait for a few more minutes to allow people to get in, and then we'll get started in a bit. Some housekeeping. You can ask your questions using the questions function in the bottom right, and you can just use the chat to share some messages or thoughts. We'll get back to all your questions at the end of this webinar. We'll hope to be able to respond to all of them, and otherwise we'll get back to you over email. The recording and the slides of the webinar will be shared with you afterwards. So you can, if you have registered or are in this call, the slides and recording will be shared with you once we finish the webinar. So no need to worry about that. All right. I think it's time to start. There will be a few more people dropping in, but let's get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar on the VSME, the emerging post-Omnibus ESG standards. My name is Jules. I'm Sustainability Solutions Manager at Coolset. I'm joined today here by Jasper.
Hi, good morning everyone. I'm Jasper. I'm one of the sustainability researchers here at Coolset, and for the past couple of weeks I've been researching VSME a lot, and before that I spent the better part of a year working on CSRD. So really trying to understand the current landscape and also how it's developing. And we'll tell you a bit more about that today.
Great. Thanks, Jasper. As mentioned before, if you have any questions, please use the questions menu in the bottom right and use the chat function to just share your thoughts. We'll get back to those at the end of this webinar. So what's the plan for today? First, we'll do a short recap of the Omnibus, because we see that's the main driver behind the sudden popularity of the VSME. Then we'll dive into what is the VSME, what's the difference between the basic and the comprehensive module. We'll discuss an example data point, and then we'll discuss potential solutions for VSME reporting. And at the end, we have some time for your questions. So to start, we have two questions to kind of see where you are currently at. So the first question is, where or are you reporting on CSRD? Three options: yes, we are still reporting on CSRD, or yes, we were reporting, but we've passed our efforts, or no, we haven't reported on CSRD yet. Please take some time to vote. We see that the majority of people here haven't reported on CSRD. And also the second most chosen option is, yes, we were reporting on CSRD, but we have passed our efforts. And a few of you are still reporting on CSRD. Then I think this webinar is especially relevant. Then the second question: are you planning to report on VSME? Either yes, likely, but we're still figuring out the details. Maybe, but it's too early to tell. Or no, we're not planning on it. And here we see, most of you are likely to report, but still figuring out the details. Others are saying maybe it's too early to tell. Few of you have already committed and are planning to report on VSME, and some of you are not planning on it. Great, thanks all for voting and to have this insight in where you are currently standing. So as a short introduction to the VSME, we'll do a short summary of the Omnibus legislation, because we see that this has suddenly sparked the interest in the VSME. So before we dive into the standard, a short review of the Omnibus itself. So the Omnibus is a proposal from the European Commission, which was published on February 26th, and has stirred a lot in the ESG community. It's the European Commission's push to simplify sustainability regulations with an aim to reduce compliance burdens, especially for mid-sized companies. What they've done is they've proposed major rollbacks to the CSRD, the EU Taxonomy, and the CSDDD, both in scope, but also in amount of data that needs to be reported. The way that this proposal is framed is as a competitive measure to make the European Union more competitive in the worldwide market. But we also see that's widely criticized, especially from sustainability department, because it's, as I said, proposing major rollbacks to the disclosure requirements that would improve transparency on sustainability. And it basically undermines the European Union's ambition to be net zero in 2050. So further breaking down the proposal, it proposes delays of the key sustainability directives with 2 years, the so-called Stop the Clock initiatives, which will be voted on the 1st of April. If that goes through, that would mean that all companies that haven't reported on CSRD yet will have a 2-year delay on their first reporting requirements. The CSRD, for the CSRD, it also reduces the number of companies required to comply with CSRD with around 80%. It weakens due diligence and accountability mechanisms under the CSDDD and makes EU taxonomy disclosures voluntarily for most firms. And what we see is that it introduces a lot of uncertainty for businesses that already invested in compliance and started gathering their data and reporting on these frameworks. So when zooming into the CSRD, we see that these are the major changes. So the company size threshold has been increased from 250 employees to more than 1,000 employees. In addition, they need to either have 50 million of revenue or 25 million euros of assets. This reduces the amount of companies covered from more than 50,000 to less than 7,000. The threshold for third country enterprises has been heightened to 450 million turnover. Value chain reporting is no longer required from non-CSRD companies. The reasonable assurance request has been removed, and the delays of 2 years are proposed. The Stop the Clock, as I said, will be voted on the 1st of April. Double materiality stays as it is. A lot of companies see this as an important strategic exercise, and the ESRS sector-specific standards have been suspended or removed completely. Now, what is good to understand is that this is still a proposal. It's not yet a law. So the next steps are that the European Parliament will review this, and then it will be approved by the European Council. 20 of the 27 European Union countries have already transposed CSRD into national law, which also means that if this proposal gets through, this also needs to be transposed in national law again. That's why we think full reversal is unlikely, and there are a lot of legal and political challenges ahead. And one important note for companies that have started reporting on CSRD already is that you should not assume that these changes are final. Now, what are your options as a company that had previously needed to report on CSRD and now are in an uncertain period? Companies with over 1,000 employees still remain in scope and can continue aligning with CSRD. Then for mid-sized companies that are committed to sustainability but are no longer in scope of the new CSRD requirements can stay on track by recognizing the competitive and financial benefits of CSRD alignment. Both as a strategic initiative, but also keeping up with their industry peers that might be mandatory for CSRD. And then for the smaller organizations looking for a practical, proportional reporting framework, the VSME is a very good option. Now, Jasper will tell you a bit more about the VSME.
Thanks, Jules. Always the issue with the microphones when switching from host, but I hope everyone can hear me well now. Yeah, so as Joe mentioned, the Omnibus has shaken up the ESG landscape quite a bit, and from the dust, maybe it's too early for it to say that it's settling, but we can see already that the VSME is coming out of it as one of the big kind of candidates for ESG reporting going ahead for companies that want to move on from CSRD. So today's webinar is really focused on giving you a deep dive in what VSME means, what kind of data points we're going to be looking at, but also giving you an idea of what the pros and cons are and what the timeline is for reporting. So to get an understanding of everyone attending today, here is one more poll question. Why are you interested in VSME? Let me just put this live. So there's 3 options here, or 4. It's cheaper and easier than CSRD. ESG is part of a long-term business strategy to meet supply chain requirements for larger companies, or other. Good to know is here you can select multiple options. So I see that by far most of you are selecting ESG as part of our long-term business strategy, which is also what I've been seeing with our customers that we've spoken to, with our CSRD customers that are considering their options in a post-regulatory landscape, and most of them are saying they want to keep going. So what we know is that a lot of companies reporting on CSRD or ESG in general, one of the main issues is putting the team together and actually starting with the sustainability reporting within the company, because you have to go to your board, you have to get the money, you have to put the team together, and I think that first going from 0 to 1 is really the hardest step for a company, and that step has been taken by a lot of these companies already now under CSRD. So I think from 0 to 1 was very complicated, and now that companies are looking ahead, they want to keep going. And that's also what we're seeing now in this poll, that 42% of you are saying that ESG is part of your long-term business strategy, 21% are saying it's cheaper and easier than CSRD, and 19% are saying to meet supply chain requirements from larger companies, and then 18% of you have said other. One more question: how are you planning to report on VSME? We're also very curious about this because it's still quite a new development. So we're curious to see how everyone's reporting on this. 4 options. 1 is with internal resources, 2 is with a software tool, 3 is with external consultants, and 4 is I'm not planning to report. So here we see that the difference between the options is a bit smaller. The slight majority of you are saying with a software tool, so that's 35%. Now internal resources is also at 35%. External consultants is at 19%, and I'm not planning to report is at 11%. So I think, surprisingly to me, to be honest, this is quite aligned with CSRD. So we're seeing with CSRD, a lot of companies also choose between internal resources, software tools, and external consultants. So here that also seems to be the case. So I hope today's webinar also gives you some more insights into what is the best option for you, and that you also have all your questions answered either during the webinar itself or during the Q&A or during any questions you may want to ask over email afterwards. So let's get right into it. So I think most of you attending today have a very basic understanding of VSME. So we're just going to kind of start at the basics and then dive in deep. So VSME stands for Voluntary Standard for Non-Listed Micro, Small, and Medium-Sized Enterprises. And what's good to note here is that this is kind of the parameters that was given to the VSME when CSRD was still around. So some companies that report on VSME now are actually listed companies. And that's also what the EFRAG and the European Union has said, because as they kind of transition companies away from CSRD, or at least say that it's no longer mandatory, they've also mentioned that they will introduce a new category of companies, which is called the small mid-cap, which we'll hear more about in Q2 of this year. So it's still a bit unsure, which is kind of the key word of this year, I think, uncertainty. But I think what's safe to say is that the VSME will apply to more than just the non-listed micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. It was published by the EFRAG in December 2024 and is 66 pages long. Interesting to note here is that 66 pages is quite short for an ESG standard. The CSRD, for example, is a couple of hundred pages, and also it's a lot more complex in the language that they use. So the VSME feels like was already designed for kind of a target audience that is a lot more focused on a practical application of ESG data points, where CSRD was often kind of very technical and complex in the language that was being used. So the final version was published in 2024 in December, with the draft already being available at the beginning of the year. So it was already around for a while, but now that we finally have that certainty, we can move forward with the final report. So VSME is mainly relevant to support large companies, banks, and investors needing ESG data. So while it's voluntary, that's kind of the big motivation for a lot of companies to report, as they want to be in good relationships with these companies, these banks, and these investors that are asking for this data. It's voluntary, so it's designed for SMEs not listed on stock exchanges, but as I mentioned, the scope is now brought in under a post-Omnibus reality. And there's two parts of these VSME. On the one hand, you have the basic module, which is kind of the minimum requirements that are part of it. And then you have the comprehensive module, which is more detailed. So more about that in a second. I think Gilles already mentioned why the sudden focus on VSME is now so relevant. But I think it's also interesting to focus specifically on the VSME and not only on kind of post-CSRD or Omnibus reality. So I think let's also focus on why VSME is relevant here. The Omnibus Proposal recommends VSME for companies no longer reporting under CSRD. I think that's really important to note here, is that while it's voluntary and while it's still kind of unsure what's going to happen in the coming months as the European Parliament kind of lets the dust settle and they discuss on the various clauses and paragraphs within the final Omnibus report, we should know that the VSME will play a central role in this, as it's mentioned several times in the Omnibus report, that the VSME will act as a central framework within this whole transition for companies that are looking to report on ESG. So what that means practically is that there will be more guidance coming out, there will be more resources spent on VSME, and there will be more focused on by public stakeholders such as governments, but also of course by private stakeholders that know that the VSME is being pushed by kind of the European Union and will thus play a central role going forward. So another point of focus is that a lot of businesses have already set up ESG teams and strategies, and they want to keep going. So I think a lot of you attending today are part of that group as well. You have those teams set up, you have the strategies in place, and now you're kind of scratching your head thinking, okay, where do we go next? What do we keep doing? And I think a lot of the companies are not there completely, and that's completely understandable. And I don't think many of you will leave today's webinar and have kind of a very certain answer. But I think, the choices now is between, okay, do we keep going with CSRD? Do we do VSME? Do we do something else altogether? And I think the VSME webinar will hopefully answer that second question. So as I mentioned, large companies with 1,000+ employees will demand ESG data from SME suppliers. That's also one of the things that's mentioned in the Omnibus Proposal. It's kind of, they call it this wall, so that companies no longer are subjected to CSRD if they don't have to report on it themselves. That was kind of one of the complaints from companies reporting under the CSRD world. Even if they didn't report on CSRD, a lot of their suppliers requested CSRD data, which mandated them to report on CSRD. So that's one of the benefits of VSME. It allows companies to report on ESG data with less restrictions. And it's, so banks and investors also prefer SMEs with sustainability reporting. I actually spoke to one of our customers recently, and she mentioned that they got a percentage, or I think it was like 0.1% reduction on their interest rate on their loan because they reported several ESG metrics. And I think that's going to be interesting going forward, because 0.1% doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're borrowing millions of euros from the bank, that really adds up. So I think that's one of the other arguments that you can look at here. It's a lighter alternative to CSRD without the legal obligations. So I think the emphasis here is on without legal obligations, because that also means that you don't have to subject it to the audit. And I think the audit is what was oftentimes most expensive. So that now that that's gone, it's easier for companies to report on ESG without the burden or the concern of having to pay for the audit, but also to take the time for the audit. And of course, the VSME prepares SMEs for future sustainability expectations, as the European Union still wants to be net zero by 2050 and is still kind of thinking about the next steps. And I can't, I don't have a future outlook, but I can say with quite a bit of certainty that going forward, there will be requirements on companies reporting on sustainability. But what that looks like, well, we're thinking that it's going to be within the world of CSRD and VSME, but it could also develop in the next 5 to 10 years. So let's give you a quick overview of the difference between VSME and CSRD. So the VSME obviously is a voluntary reporting standard, where CSRD was mandatory under EU law. VSME now applies to at least 43,000 companies, where CSRD applies to 7,000 companies, but previously applied to 50,000 plus companies. So I kind of did the calculation that all the companies that no longer report on CSRD report on VSME or can report on VSME. So that's 43,000. But actually, it's a much higher number even, because this is only the companies that were previously under the scope of CSRD. But what we're seeing also is that there's a huge kind of opportunity here for companies to start reporting on VSME voluntarily, even if previously they didn't fall under CSRD, because it is such an approachable and tangible framework. It requires considerably less time than CSRD, and it's quite easy to collect that data. So where CSRD often had very complex data points, such as kind of this financial risk modeling, or asking you to map the financial flows to fossil fuel industries that you're investing in, like data points that just require a lot of time to think about, but also to research. The VSME is really quite a straightforward framework in itself. So I think that also opens the door to many more companies that were previously not reporting at all to start considering the options for reporting on ESG data, and to see the benefits from both an economic and a climate perspective for the company. So third point here is that it's simplified and proportional disclosures, which is, I guess, the point I just raised. And then for CSRD, it's detailed and follows ESRS, which stands for the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And what's good to note here is that actually there's quite a bit of similarity, because the VSME also looks at the paragraph AR16 from the CSRD, which is basically the topics, subtopics, and sub-subtopics mentioned under the ESRS. So the VSME also looks at that. And just to give you a bit of context there, those topics, subtopics, and sub-subtopics are, for example, climate change, with the subtopic being climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, or ESRS S1 on workforce, within a subtopic of working conditions. Those kind of topics and subtopics are also mentioned in VSME. So there is a bit of overlap, which also makes it really useful for companies that have already, for example, done a DMA under CSRD and now want to switch. You can use that DMA and those insights in your VSME report as well. So for VSME, there's no legal consequences for non-compliance, whereas with CSRD, non-compliance can lead to penalties. And then also that brings me to the next point, which is that for VSME, there's no audit costs, and for CSRD, the audit costs can be up to 150,000 euros, but they can even be higher depending on the kind of company. But of course, they can also be a lot smaller for the companies we've seen. So I've heard numbers ranging from 20,000 or even 15,000 to upwards of 150,000. So there's a big range there, but those costs are now no longer having to be made by companies that are not mandatorily that don't have to report on CSRD. And then the last point here is that the VSME is designed to support SME financing and supply chains, whereas the CSRD was designed for regulatory compliance and transparency. So the kind of the motivation for companies to report is quite different, but at the end of the day, the kind of goal to have an ESG report on the table, or at least on your website, still remains. So let's go into the VSME module itself. As I mentioned, there's two levels. There's the basic module, which is minimum reporting, and then there's the comprehensive model, which is detailed reporting. The comprehensive includes all the basic modules, disclosures, plus additional ESG details. So that's an important distinction here to make, is that they're not separate entities that you have to kind of glue together. But companies that report on comprehensive automatically also include basic. Companies that start with basic can then easily switch to comprehensive, as this is merely kind of an addition of data points. So the two are quite closely linked. Basic covers general company info, ESG policies, energy, emissions, waste, workforce, and governance, for example. And comprehensive adds then strategy, greenhouse gas targets, climate risks, supply chain impact, gender diversity, and human rights. So these kind of data points, which you might already notice from the description of these, the different elements of basic and comprehensive, is that basic is a lot more quantitative. So it really asks about the very kind of straightforward data points that you can report, such as your emissions and your waste numbers, workforce numbers. Whereas the comprehensive module then goes a bit deeper and asks about, okay, what are the risks associated? What are the impacts on your supply chain? What are kind of the more qualitative data points that you can report on in order to give your stakeholders the necessary information that they need in order to get a full picture and decide whether they want to partner up with you as a company. So I would say that's the main difference. So another point here is that SMEs choose the module based on their needs and stakeholder demands. So there's no kind of checklist that tells you which one is right for you. Also, they are voluntary, so that means that you can choose yourself, of course. But what we're seeing is that a lot of stakeholders are requiring the comprehensive module because they're still looking to understand why companies or what risks certain companies have, but especially what they're doing to mitigate those risks. And that question is part of the comprehensive module. Large clients, investors, or banks may also require the comprehensive module for the reasons I just described. So understanding the basic module, let's have a look at this. So this is simplified proportional reporting, and it covers 11 key areas, including business info, ESG policies, and basic environmental, social, and governance metrics. So let's look at the different ESG pillars here. And remind you, these are more or less the same pillars that are being used in ESRS, but then have a bit of a different structure when it comes to the way it's set up. But overall, you won't be very surprised when you transition from CSRD to VSME. So for environmental, the main data points here are energy use, emissions, pollution, waste, and water use. Very straightforward, I would say. Social is workforce data, health and safety, fair pay, and training. For governance, it's anti-corruption fines and ethical business conduct. So I think a lot of you are also wondering, okay, how much work is this actually to report? I would say that it's around 50 data points in the basic module, and then another 50 data points in the comprehensive module. But compare that to the 1,100 data points in CSRD, and you already understand that this is a lot more tangible and a lot more accessible for a lot of companies. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, the VSME, the data points themselves are a lot more readily available. So you have to look at HR reports and financial statements and do some internet research, but it's a lot more readily available than a lot of the CSRD data points. And then finally on this slide, the basic module is designed for minimal reporting burden while aligning with key sustainability requirements. Let's go over to the comprehensive module. So what's the difference, or at least what's the added value of the comprehensive module? So it expands on the basic module with additional ESG disclosures. I think that's clear by now. And it covers long-term strategies, sustainability risks, and impacts on your supply chain. So it adds climate-related data, such as Scope 3 emissions, reduction targets, and transition plans. And here's also good to note that the basic module only focuses on Scope 1 and Scope 2, but for comprehensive, you're also looking at Scope 3 data. And we're seeing now that Scope 3 data is getting more and more relevant. I think everyone knows what Scope 3 is, but just to kind of give a very short explainer, Scope 3 data is basically the emission data for your whole supply chain, and requires quite a bit more work than your Scope 1 and 2 emission data, which mainly relies on your operational emissions based on, for example, fuel consumption and electricity consumption. So we're seeing that that's becoming a lot more relevant now, also, for example, as the B Corp organization has made Scope 3 emissions mandatory under their new kind of requirements for B Corp companies. Then we see for the social metrics that the gender diversity, human rights policies, and labor risks are introduced for the comprehensive module. And then for the governance, they include financial disclosures on high-risk sectors, such as fossil fuels and controversial industries. So we see that comprehensive is a bit more qualitative, but I would say for the companies that are kind of scared off by qualitative disclosures or by some more research, I would say that aside from all of the arguments that I've given on why you should report, or at least why it's good to share this with your banks and your investors and your suppliers. Reporting your climate risks or researching them is actually a really good step, considering the imminent effects of climate change that are about to reach us. And I'm not talking about full-scale climate disasters in the Netherlands or in other parts of Europe, but I'm more talking about the things we don't really see right now, but that might affect us in the future, such as, for example, supply chain risks or kind of the import from countries that are much more at risk of climate change, and how that might increase your prices, or, for example, the risk of your solar panels being damaged by hailstorms as they increase in the future. These are all things that you should consider, not just because your stakeholders require it, but also because it's good business practice to have a strategy that includes the future risks associated not only with financial metrics, but also with non-financial metrics. And I would say the comprehensive module, the last point here, is that it's useful for SMEs working with large corporations who are seeking ESG-focused financing. So about collecting the data, I would say, as I mentioned, it's quite straightforward, or at least, relatively accessible. Start with your internal records. So, collect utility bills, have payrolls, look at your payroll, consider supplier invoices, employee contracts, and then also leverage existing compliance reports that you may have done or may have considered in the past. So that's, for example, the ISO 14001, the EMAS, which is the Eco Management Audit Scheme, which is also now kind of this new framework that's coming up. And then you can also look at your financial statements, of course. But it's also useful to consider carbon footprint calculators, especially for your Scope 3 and ESG tracking software. So what I would say is important is that you need to keep records consistent for annual comparisons and stakeholder requests. This is self-explanatory for your financial metrics or for your financial data. But I think as companies start reporting on non-financial data, it's also important to reiterate that this is also one of the main elements of that should be one of the main elements of your reporting. So here's an example of a data point that you should, that's part of the basic module. Also to give you a bit of an explainer, so this is called B3. B stands for basic. You also have other data points that are called C1, C2, C3. I think you know where I'm getting at, but those are the comprehensive data points. So B3 asks about energy and greenhouse gas emissions, and paragraph 29 looks at total energy consumption. You see here I posted a small screenshot of the VSME framework, and then you see here point 29 with the table below. So it asks companies to consider total energy consumption in megawatt hours, and then look at total electricity and fuel use split by renewable and non-renewable energy. So what do you collect in order to answer this question? So you look at your electricity bills, so then you consider monthly, annual kilowatt hour usage. Then you look at fuel invoices. Here you have to convert your liters to megawatt hours. It's pretty useful because the VSME framework itself gives already kind of the conversion units that you should consider for how much liter of fuel or gasoline is, how much megawatt hours is that, but also, for example, for natural gas, it tells you how much megawatt hours is in 1 cubic meter of gas. So these are all kind of conversion units that you can use. But of course, you can also use meter readings so you can track your direct consumption. And last but not least, what we're seeing is that a lot of companies do want to report but don't have it readily available, this data. So then you need to reach out to your facility managers or your suppliers to request this energy data. So this is just one data point, out of I would say around 100. But it does show, I think, that it's quite tangible and quite accessible, and they just need to spend some time on getting everything together. But that when you do, that it's really manageable to report on these data points. So to wrap up my story here, I think what I would say is that the VSME brings companies from uncertainty to opportunity, as the VSME offers a structured ESG reporting and builds on the ESRS, as I mentioned. It also meets stakeholder and investor expectations, even if the CSRD is weakened, and it reduces compliance burden while maintaining credibility in ESG reporting. It is not mandatory. There's no mandatory audit requirement, which makes sustainability reporting more cost-effective, and it takes weeks instead of months. So I hope that gave you all a bit of an introduction into VSME. We will be hosting another webinar in the future on the kind of the really nitty-gritty of the VSME, telling you how to structure the report and what to consider once you have started. So keep an eye out for that. But for now, I hope everyone has a deeper understanding. I'm going to hand it over to Jules, and then to talk about solutions, and then we'll go over to the Q&A after that.
Yes, thanks, Jasper. I'll keep this short as we have a lot of questions coming in. But yeah, solutions to for VSME reporting. With Coolset, we have developed a sustainability platform for mid-market companies. As Jasper explained, we were first helping companies with CSRD compliance, and recently we've added our VSME module to the compliance management, so that you can also start reporting on the VSME standard. So for VSME, as Jasper shared, the focus is on sharing relevant reporting with internal and external stakeholders to enhance integrity and trust with actually being able to show the evidence. And our platform ensures full interoperability between the VSME and the ESRS. So whether you started reporting on CSRD and want to transition to VSME, or you're starting to prepare with VSME for later CSRD compliance, all the data that's overlapping is automatically synced between these two modules. So what can you do in the platform? You collect the relevant ESG data in one place and share insight with stakeholders. You effortlessly generate structured ESG reports according to, for example, the VSME framework. We enable cross-team collaboration and task management, so everyone that's involved in the reporting has one place to go to, both for communication, reporting, and collection of data. And as I said before, we sync the data between the many interoperable frameworks. So to conclude, the Coolset platform is a flexible ESG platform that evolves with the regulations. It's one system for all your ESG reporting needs, whether that's VSME, EU Taxonomy, or carbon accounting. We've built in a lot of automation to reduce manual efforts, build in flexibility for future changes, and provide transparent and reliable reporting that stands the test of time. That's it from our side. Thanks for joining all. We have a lot of questions coming in, so we'll now take the remaining time of this webinar to try to answer those questions. We might not get to all of them, but we'll get back to you over email if that's the case for your question. So Jasper, maybe you want to...
So as Jules mentioned, we're going to spend the next couple of minutes answering the questions. We'll probably go over time a little bit for those that want to stick around. But for those that can't, we'll be sure to answer your question over email if we haven't gotten back to you today. So Colinda asks, let me just answer it live here. What are the consequences of the fact that the CSRD has not yet been transposed in Dutch law? How should companies take this fact into account, / what are the practical differences as compared to countries where CSRD has been transposed? It's a really good question. So we're seeing now, of course, the Netherlands has quite a conservative government and doesn't have any interest in transposing CSRD, or at least not making any effort to do that quickly. We're seeing different signals. So I think one of the main things you should consider here is that if a directive is imposed by the European Union, companies need to report on it regardless. So then just because the Netherlands hasn't transposed it doesn't mean that Dutch companies shouldn't have to report on it. It rather means that the Dutch government is at serious risk of getting more fines from the European Parliament. So for now, it means keep reporting under the existing European law, but do also keep in mind that there are developments being made, of course, under the Omnibus, but also under the changes to the Omnibus as the debates are happening soon. Maybe also to give a bit of a context on the Omnibus process right now. On the 1st of April, the European Parliament is voting on the Stop the Clock initiative, which basically would mean that before they discuss and debate about all of the specific changes to the CSRD, they would all agree that it's being postponed by 2 years, so that the companies at least have the certainty that that suddenly it's mandatory again, and they actually have to publish their report in the beginning of 2026. Question here from Leonard: what are the competitive/financial advantages of reporting for CSRD when not mandatory? So the CSRD is a lot more extensive, and also gives you a lot more access to different data that's strays away from the financial data. I would say that also the DMA, which is part of the CSRD but not the VSME, is a really big benefit, because it allows you to kind of assess all of your IROs, which are your impacts, risks, and opportunities, and do this within the context of the ESRS data points. So I think for companies that are already well underway and have ESG teams set up, I think there's a really big benefit of reporting on CSRD rather than VSME. Question here that Shu posted, or I think he took it from the chat. Question from Robin: is it correct that the EFRAG comes with a new VSME? So the EFRAG is the organization that has published all the official VSME reports, as well as the CSRD reports. So they have published the VSME end of December 2024, and as far as I know, this is the final version. So it might be that they make adjustments as the kind of the Omnibus proposal shakes up the reporting landscape again, or for example, they change the definition of what the VSME is, because as I mentioned, it's now made officially for non-listed micro to small to medium enterprises. But I think that might be, maybe the title changes. I think the content itself won't change. I see that Shu also answered some questions over the chat, so I think we can move those. Let's see, I have a question from Anik. What kind of data will large companies start to request from SMEs? So that depends on the company, but generally speaking, it's about environment. It's split up in the ESG pillars, and it depends on the type of framework that you're reporting on. So I think there's a bit of flexibility. Oftentimes, suppliers just want to see that you are up to speed with your ESG metrics, and that you're reporting, and that you're aware of your ESG data points. And I think the VSME is a good starting point for companies that want to do that. So if a large company knocks on your door and they say, hey, well, we want to partner up with you, but we do need some kind of ESG metrics, if you can provide them with a comprehensive VSME report, then that is set up in a way that it includes all of the data points, or most of the data points that the large suppliers would want. And if there are suppliers that want more data points, then you can add those voluntarily to the VSME standard. Question from Laurens. Concerning CSRD value chain reporting, does value chain reporting mean that the data should be collected from all suppliers up until raw material suppliers, or only from primary/secondary suppliers? This is a really good question. So one of the big points from CSRD was that they want to reduce the reporting scope in the value chain to reduce it to only tier 1 suppliers, which is the primary supplier. So for VSME, that's also going to apply, but essentially it is voluntary. So there's also less of a requirement here for you to kind of consider the full scope of the value chain. But considering kind of the current parameters for the CSRD, I would transpose that also to VSME and say that you only focus on your tier 1 suppliers, except for where there's kind of these material climate risks, where then you look at the broader spectrum. But I would say also here, I've often said this within CSRD, but within VSME, also use this common sense approach. So see what makes sense for you as a company, and if you are kind of if your main product has a lot of climate risks along the value chain, then of course it makes sense to just go beyond the primary supplier. And maybe to go on a bit of a note here, mention a note here. Yes, the VSME is voluntary, so there is a bit of more flexibility in how you report on data points. It doesn't mean that you can cherry pick the data points you report on, as you are still reporting on a VSME framework. So the choice to report on it is voluntary, but once you report on it, you need to select all of the mandatory data points. And then, of course, there are also voluntary data points within the voluntary framework. So those can then be selected based on your company's materiality. Question from Aurelie. What is the difference between VSME and voluntary CSRD? Would voluntary CSRD have legal or audit obligations? No. So voluntary CSRD doesn't have legal or audit obligations, at least not for the next couple of years until it might become mandatory again. The main difference here, of course, is that the VSME is, in that sense, a lot smaller in terms of the scope. So a CSRD has 1,100 data points, which, of course, you don't report on all of them because the DMA cuts it down by quite a bit. But the VSME only has around 100. So that's the main difference. And I would also say that the VSME is a bit more practical, less technical. I think the main benefit of the CSRD in this case is that it really kind of unlocks more access to different types of suppliers, investors, and different partners that are looking for a more in-depth ESG report. I see quite a bit more questions, so I'm going to go through 3 more questions, and then we'll end it for today, and then answer all of the questions over email to the ones that we haven't got to today. Another question from Lawrence. What would be the final deliverable for VSME reporting? Would it also be integrated into the annual report? Good question. So as it's voluntary, it doesn't have to be integrated into the annual report. That was only a requirement under the CSRD because it was this mandatory paragraph. For the VSME, you may choose to do so, but it is not mandatory. At the end of the day, the VSME report will look or can look quite similar to the CSRD report in terms of design. So you will have your general information section, you will have your ESG section, so the environmental, social, and governance section. And then you'll have your kind of conclusions on the whole process. The main difference here is that I would say the DMA is not mandatory. So the section on the DMA or the double materiality assessment won't be there or won't be as big, because I think at Coolset we do recommend companies to still do a DMA in some form, as it allows you to kind of focus on the important topics. Question from Sarah. Do you know if EFRAG will release an implementation guidance document listing all disclosure points like they did in the full ESRS? Good question. We're also keeping an eye out. I do think that now that the EFRAG has fully pivoted to VSME, they will put out a lot more on this. I know recently, I think the last 2 weeks, they published a whole video series on the VSME in multiple languages, and they've been invited by the European Commission to have these roundtable conversations on how to improve the collaboration. So the EFRAG is definitely still in the game. And now that the game is moving towards the VSME, I think EFRAG will put a lot of effort into making the VSME more accessible. Then question from Leonard, can I use the VSME report from a supplier for my CSRD mandatory report? Yes, so that's a good question. That depends also on the CSRD report, but generally speaking, the Omnibus report also mentions that the VSME is specifically designated as kind of this wall between CSRD reporters and non-CSRD reporters, as it now allows companies reporting on VSME, or at least allows companies that are being asked about their ESG data from CSRD reporters to also use a VSME report. So I would say maybe the answer is a bit complex, but the short answer is yes, you can use your VSME report for a supplier that is doing a CSRD report. I still see a couple of questions. I think for the sake of your time, we're going to end it here. So thanks everyone for your questions. Thanks everyone for attending today. I hope you got some useful information out of this. Should you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to Gilles or to me. Our email addresses are in the screen here. And you can also download our post-Omnibus Market Pulse report, which we published yesterday, and has a lot of interesting insights into what we're seeing in the market now in terms of companies reporting on CSRD and VSME and beyond. Thanks so much, everyone, and see you for the next webinar, hopefully.